Welcome to the series of Relational Database Management System. Myself is Fatima Rafiq, Assistant Professor, Abhidanam Das Senior College, BCA Department. We have already started with the unit number 3, that is Transaction Management. We have seen what is transaction, state of transaction, and properties of transaction. Today we will see what is actually a concurrency. Concurrency, if you see the dictionary meaning of concurrency, it is nothing but managing the simultaneously operation without conflicting with each other. Like if you consider yourself and if you are riding a bike at that time, what the multiple things you can do? You can ride, do a cycle riding, you can listen to the music, you can looking into the hurdles, and you can doing the horn. You're giving a horn at the same time. So these are some simultaneously performing actions which you would do when you ride a cycle. What is the concurrency control? Concurrency control is a procedure in the database management system for managing simultaneous operation without conflicting with each other. Concurrency here in the database is with the reading and writing data at the same time. As we know that whenever we consider the transaction can have a 4 type of operations, that is read, write, commit, and rollback. So the most of the time the transaction will contain the operation reading and writing. But if the reading and writing is happening at the same time, there may be a possible situation where the concurrency control has to be done. Concurrent access is quite easy if all users are just reading the data. There is no way they can interfere with each other. Like for example, if you are reading any data in the databases, so if you are using, there may be some possible cases where one single user is reading from the single data. There is 100% no concurrent, no problem with this type of operation. There may be a situation where the multiple user reading from the single data. There are multiple users, but they are actually reading the single data. So because it is reading, reading is done, so the changes is not done in the data item, so it can be also allowed. There is some third case where the multiple user is reading from the multiple data. We have a multiple users and every user is again doing a reading, but multiple data they are reading. So these are 3 cases when the concurrency does not have any problem. Then when we consider or we thought of any particular database where we are having a operation which is mix of reading and writing operations. Hence here in this situation concurrency is a challenge. And when we are doing a writing, actually the single user, when it is writing in the single data, we have only one database item and we are writing into it, so it does not create any problem. But when we have a multiple user who is writing on the same single data, at that time there may be a conflict. That is one user which is written the data, and then again the next user came and it writes or overwrites the data, same data item. At that time the concurrency is a challenge for us. Concurrency control is nothing but it is used to address such conflict which mostly occur with a multiple user system. If you have a system which is a multi-user system, it means that multiple users are accessing the system at same time. At that time there is a concurrency control we need to implement. It helps you to make sure that the database transactions are performed concurrently without violating the data integrity of respective databases. So all the 4 properties that we have seen in the last lecture, that is the ACID property, has to be implemented when we are using these operations, and when the operations actually the transactions are performing at same time. Therefore, the concurrency control is the most important element for the proper functioning of the system, where 2 or more database transactions that require access to the same data are executed simultaneously. Like for example, if one user is there and he is using the transaction data item A, and another user came and he is using the transaction data item A again, and both want the data access for a writing purposes. At that time we need to plan this very proper manner, so it should not create the inconsistency in the database. It is actually a duty of concurrency control manager to control these concurrency problems. Advantage of concurrent execution of transaction. As we know that when we say transaction is concurrent, actually there are multiple transactions which is running at same time. So why we are actually allowing the concurrent execution of transaction at same time? Because it has some certain advantages. Executing multiple transactions simultaneously is called concurrent execution. This has to be done with the extra care because of the complications that would arise in some cases. Though the execution of transactions serially may involve consistency, safety and like features, we cannot compromise time on the serial execution. We need to implement the concept of concurrent execution of transaction much more in the multi-user system. There are some advantages which are listed below, like improved throughput. The number of transactions that can be executed in a given amount of time is called throughput. How many number of transactions actually you are executing at that particular given time is nothing but a throughput. When we execute the multiple transactions simultaneously, that increases the transaction throughputs. Like for example, if you consider one CPU, it is executing one transaction. After completing one transaction, then next transaction. After completing next transaction, then next transaction. So this is a serial transaction. When one transaction is getting completed, and then the next transaction is executed, and then the next transaction executed. At that time, the throughput of a CPU is very less. But when we are executing multiple transactions simultaneously, what it will increase? It will increase in the throughput. The next advantage is resource utilization. As we know that multiple transactions require multiple resources. It is about using the various system resources like disk, CPU concurrently. We all know that the most of the time the resources are not utilized properly. When a transaction is using a CPU, we may permit the other transaction to use the IO device, IO disk, fetch the data from the disks to the main memory. This way the utilization of resources can be increased. We have a different kind of resources, but if we use only the serial transaction where the one resource is getting utilized at one time, so resource utilization is very less. While when we have a number of transactions, if one transaction is requires CPU storage, will give the CPU storage, and when the another transaction, if it require disk IO's fetch, we can at the same time give the permission to the transaction to access the disk spaces. So here because of this, the utilization of the resources will become more and more. It reduces the waiting time. When we execute the concurrent transactions, at that time the waiting time of the transactions are getting lesser and lesser. Consider a situation where the transactions are executed serially. The transaction may be of any size. When executing serially, one longer transaction is executing and very small transaction may be on a queue for its turn. That increase the wait time of the small transaction. Hence, if we execute the transaction simultaneously, the waiting time would be much reduced when compared to the serial execution of the transaction. So, if we want to reduce the waiting time for the transaction, we can implement the transaction in concurrent fashion. Average response time of transactions increase. The average time consumed by the transaction to complete since its start is called as average response time. In concurrent execution, as a multiple transactions are getting executed simultaneously, by sharing the system resources, the waiting time is reduced, which in terms increase the average response time. Like for example, you will be having a n number of transactions, and that n number of transactions getting executed simultaneously. So the waiting time of these transactions are very less. It increases the average response time. Like for example, the transaction 1 came at 10:30 and it is getting executed at 10:34. So here the waiting time has become less and less, and the average response time will become more and more. So these are the advantages of using the concurrent execution of transaction. If you have any query, any doubt regarding this particular topic, you can write in the comment box.